Some champions are born in capitals, in cities built on money, power and history. Places where football success feels almost inevitable, where titles are expected, not questioned. We are taught this logic from a young age, that winners come from the same places, that certain clubs are simply meant to rise. And then, sometimes, football does something dangerous. It breaks its own rules, because this season, Swedish football crowned a champion that doesn't fit the script in any way. Not a giant, not a historic powerhouse, not a club built for Europe. A team from a place so small, most football fans outside Sweden have never even heard of it. A village on the coast, surrounded by sea, wind and silence. And that is what makes this moment uncomfortable. Because if a club like this can win it all, then the entire hierarchy of football starts to feel fragile again. If they can do it, then suddenly every so-called small club has a reason to believe. But here's the thing, Mjällby didn't win by accident, this wasn't one lucky run, it wasn't one extraordinary player. It was a miracle that appeared out of nowhere. This title wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it didn't arrive with fireworks, it arrived quietly. Built over the years no one was watching, by a club that learned how to survive, long before it ever learned how to win. A club that never chased attention, never promised greatness, never tried becoming something it wasn't. And now, almost without warning, they are champions. So how does that happen? How does a village club from one of the smallest places in Swedish football end up standing above everyone else? How do you go from being happy just to stay up to lifting the league title? And maybe more important, what does that say about football itself? Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is the story of Mjällby. This episode is sponsored by Hidden Shirt Club. They sell football shirt mystery boxes with the real stories. Mjällby is not a city. It doesn't even try to be. It is a village located on Swedish southern coast in the region of Blekinge. A quiet place. Just over 1,000 inhabitants, no skyline, no rush. Here, life follows a different rhythm. The sea, the weather, the seasons. People don't disappear into crowds here, they recognize each other. They remember faces. And when something like this happens, everyone feels it. At the center of this village stands a football club, Mjällby AIF. Founded in 1939, not as a project, not as a business, but as something deeply local. A club created by the village for the village. It wasn't built to conquer Swedish football, it wasn't built to dream of Europe, it was built to exist. A place where people could gather, where names mattered, where weekends had a meaning. The stadium, Strandvallen, sits almost modestly in its surroundings. Fields, houses, open space. Capacity around 5,000. By modern football standards, that number feels almost symbolic. And yet, on match days, those seats tell a different story. Because for a place like Mjällby, this club is not entertainment, it is identity. For decades, football here was not ambition, it was about continuity, showing up, staying connected, belonging. While bigger clubs spoke about growth and success, Mjällby spoke about survival. And that difference matters. Because in places like this, football doesn't disappear when the results drop. It doesn't vanish when attention fades, it just waits. It becomes part of daily life, part of memory, part of who people are. Children grow up with this club, not because it wins, but because it's there. Parents pass it on, grandparents remember old games, old seasons, old struggles. Mjällby was never about moments, it was about presence. and for a very long time that presence went completely unnoticed by the rest of the country, which is exactly how this story was allowed to grow. For most of its existence, Mjällby AIF did not live in moments of glory. It lived in cycles: promotion, relegation, rebuilding, repeating. The club reached the Allsvenskan, Swedish top division, for the very first time in 1980. For a village club, that alone felt unreal. But it didn't last. Mjällby went back down, then up again, then down once more. And that pattern would define the club for decades. Between 1980 and 2010, Mjällby never truly established itself as a top-flight club. They were visitors, temporary guests. Some seasons ended in relief, others in disappointment. But almost all of them ended the same way, with the club still standing. And that mattered. Because while success came and went, Mjällby never disappeared. They didn't gamble to stay up, they didn't overspend chasing relevance, they accepted what they were. A small club, from a small place, trying to survive in a league that increasingly rewarded size and power. While Swedish football grew more professional, more commercial, more focused on export and Europe, Mjällby stayed grounded. There were no famous academy graduates, no iconic generations, no defining matches that entered national folklore. Just seasons, hard seasons, seasons where the club wasn't to compete for trophies, but simply to remain part of the conversation, finishing 12th instead of 14th, avoiding relegation playoffs, staying alive. And that kind of football rarely gets remembered, but it teaches something important. It teaches restraint, it teaches realism, it teaches patience. Mjällby learned how to lose without collapsing, how to win without believing the hype. They learned that survival is a skill. And quietly, without anyone noticing, that skill became their foundation. To truly understand why Mjällby's title feels almost unreal, you need to zoom out. You need to understand how Swedish football works. The Allsvenskan is not a chaotic league, it doesn't reward sudden miracles, it rewards structure, stability, youth development and financial discipline. For decades, the league has been dominated by few clubs from Sweden's largest cities. Mjällby, backed by history, European experience and the country's strongest academy. AIK and Djurgården, clubs from Stockholm with massive followings, commercial power and constant media attention. These are the clubs built to win, they have large budgets, bigger clubs and infrastructure designed for success. Mjällby had none of that. The reward was among the smallest in the league, their stadium was modest, their fanbase almost entirely local. They didn't sell players for millions, they didn't attract international headlines. On paper, Mjällby should never have been more than a survivor. A club fighting to stay up, a name filling out the league table. And history supports that logic. Before their title, league champions almost always came from the same group, the same cities, the same institutions. Small clubs could surprise for a few matches, occasionally finish high, but winning the league, that was not part of the design, and that's why Mjällby was ignored. Not out of disrespect, but out of habit. They didn't look like a contender, they didn't sound like one. There was no narrative to sell, no stars to promote. And while the rest of Swedish football focused on ambition, Mjällby focused on something else. Consistency. They didn't try to become Malmö, they didn't copy Stockholm, they built something that fit their reality, and for a long time that felt invisible. Until it wasn't. There was no moment where everything suddenly changed. No takeover, no announcement, no headline that said Mjällby is coming. What happened here was quieter than that, almost invisible. While other clubs chased progress through speed, Mjällby chose repetition. They focused on what they could control, not reputation, not status, but suitability. Recruitment was not about names, it was about profiles. Players who could handle physical football, players who understood structure, players who were comfortable without attention. Mjällby didn't need stars, they needed balance. They looked for players who would improve the collective, not dominate it. Many arrived from places that didn't generate hype, lower divisions, smaller leagues. Players overlooked elsewhere. Not because they lacked talent, but because they didn't fit the image bigger clubs were looking for. Mjällby gave them something different. Stability, trust, clarity. Roles were defined, expectations were clear. You run, you defend, you commit. No one was promised greatness, everyone was promised responsibility. Season after season, the squad evolved slowly. No panic signings, no complete rebuilds. Players stayed longer than usual. Chemistry grew naturally, and while the rest of the league spoke about ambition, Mjällby spoke about preparation. Training sessions were intense but repetitive. Tactics were clear and rarely changed, not because they lacked imagination, but because consistency was their advantage. They became difficult to beat, uncomfortable to face. Opponents knew what was coming and still struggled to stop it. This was not beautiful football, it was reliable football. And reliability over time adds up. By the time the season began, Mjällby were not dreaming, they were ready. The season started quietly. No bold predictions, no title talk. Most pundits placed Mjällby somewhere near the bottom half of the team. Avoid relegation, stay competitive. That was the expectation. And for the first weeks, nothing seemed unusual. Mjällby won matches, but not spectacularly. 1-goal margins, hard-fought fights. Strong defensive performances. It felt temporary. A good run, nothing more. But the wins kept coming. By the early stages of the season, Mjällby were still there. Top 4, top 3. People started to look twice. Then came the first tests. A run of matches against stronger opposition. Away games, pressure. Mjällby didn't blink. They didn't dominate, they endured. Defending deep when needed, punishing mistakes, staying disciplined. Slowly, the tone around the club began to change. Not excitement, but suspicion. Could they really keep this up? By mid-season, Mjällby were no longer a curiosity, they were a problem. Opponents adjusted their tactics, media attention increased, and the questions followed. How long can they last? What happens when pressure arrives? And the pressure did arrive. Every match now mattered. Every point felt heavier. For players who had spent most of their careers fighting relegation, this was new territory. The table didn't just show survival anymore, it showed possibility. And that is where seasons often collapse. But Mjällby didn't chase the table, they ignored it. Same routines, same preparation, no speeches about history, no talks about titles. Just the next match. Week after week, they stayed near the top. Then came the final stretch. The points where legs feel heavier, where doubts grow louder, where clubs either break or reveal who they really are. Mjällby revealed themselves. They didn't accelerate, they didn't panic, they slowly slowed the game down, controlled moments and protected their leads. And when the decisive matches arrived, they didn't freeze, they finished the job. When the final whistle blew, Mjällby AIF were champions of Sweden for the first time in their history. A club from a village, from the coast, from nowhere, standing above everyone else. Not because they were best individually, but because they were never unprepared. The moment itself did not explode. There were no fireworks lighting up a skyline, no city squares overflowing with noise, because Mjällby doesn't have a skyline, and it doesn't have a square built for celebration. What it had was silence. A silence filled with disbelief. Supporters standing still, as if afraid the moment would disappear if they moved too fast. Some had waited decades for this, others had grown up believing it could never happen. Older supporters remembered the first years, the promotions that didn't last, the relegation that hurt quietly. Younger ones had never seen the club fight for anything more than survival, and now suddenly they were champions. For the players, many of whom had spent their entire careers moving clubs between divisions and expectations. This felt unreal, not because they hadn't worked for it, but because they had never been told to expect it. No one arrived in Mjällby dreaming of a league title. They arrived hoping to belong. That is why the celebration felt different. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was heavy. Heavy with meaning. Because this wasn't just a season 1, it was years of patience validated. Years of choosing stability over spectacle, years of accepting limits instead of fighting them. For one season, everything aligned. And when it did, a village learned what it feels like to stand above the entire country. Mjällby didn't change football, but it reminded football of something it tends to forget. That success doesn't always come from speed, or noise, or ambition shouted out loud. Sometimes success comes from restraint, from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to become anything else. Mjällby didn't chase growth, they didn't chase relevance, they chased balance. And in a sport obsessed with expansion, that choice feels almost radical. This title wasn't built on shortcuts, it wasn't built on risk, it was built on repetition, on doing the same things again and again, until they were done well enough to matter. For smaller clubs across Europe, this story carries weight. It says that patience is not weakness, that limits don't always need to be broken, sometimes they need to be respected. Mjällby didn't outspend anyone, they didn't outshine anyone, they outlasted them. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable lesson of all, that football still allows places like this to matter. That even in a game increasingly dominated by money and scale, there is still room for communities that refuse to rush. This wasn't a miracle, it was preparation meeting opportunity. Mjällby will never be a metropolis. Its streets will never fill with traffic, its stadium will never dominate a skyline. But somewhere on Sweden's southern coast, a village knows something now. It knows what patience feels like when it finally pays off. It knows what it means to wait without demanding reward. And maybe that's the quiet beauty of the story. That history doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives softly, almost unnoticed, until it's already happening. A title won far from the spotlight, a moment shared by people who never expected to witness it. Mjällby AIF didn't ask for football attention, it waited. And when the moment came, it was ready. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more clubs, consider to leave a like and subscribe to my channel.